Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents The Cavalry Cycle. This time, we're going to begin 30 Toes Short. Cote Deese lounged in the glow of an early summer evening. Buckjack and Carlin stepped out to look it over. John Buckjack Weldon and Julian Carlin, sometimes called Style, were both trainee cavalrymen in the dedicated cavalry of Grand Normandy. Last summer, along with 4 other young men, they had presented themselves at the cavalry base, been shot with enchanted arrows, and become horses from the waist down. It was called the dedicated cavalry for good reason. But they differed as centaurs quite as much as they had differed when they were men simple. Carlin was a paint, white with big patches of ruddy brown. He had been on a sweaty endurance march from early morning until mid-afternoon, but that coat was now gleaming again. He wore his dress uniform jacket, red with white piping, and a blue Stetson almost the same as the standard dress hat, but with a customized Australian curl to the brim, allowing him to show off a piratical earring. Beard and mustache, a darker brown than his patches, as were his hair and tail, were freshly trimmed and waxed to points, framing a crooked smile. His hooves were polished. There was a definite prance to his walk. Then there was Buckjack. He was a buckskin, hence the nickname bestowed by Carlin, with fawn coat and dark hair, beard, legs, and tail. He wore only the standard ruddy brown duty Stetson and the matching T-shirt that was fatigues for him. He had given himself a good wash-off and rub-down when the day's march was over, but his coat and hooves did not shine. He paced soberly next to Carlin and knew he looked like the sidekick, if not the pack animal, even though he was almost a hand taller than Carlin, and even though it had been his idea to go look about the town. "So how big is this place?" Carlin asked, glancing up and down the street, or maybe road. It was unpaved and held foot traffic, a couple of horse-drawn wagons, and in the distance something like a golf cart. On one side stood the stores, on the other were the docks. "I don't know the population," Buckjack answered. "Nothing like London, of course." Carlin was from London. "I'm sure it's not even as big as Stirk," the small coastal city Buckjack came from. "I expect we saw half of it on the march in." He thought he was starting to sound apologetic and decided there was no need. Not everywhere had to be a metropolis. "It is the biggest settlement on Brickell." Carlin nodded, still half smiling. He looked along the road. "And things are picking up," he remarked approvingly. There was more traffic than when they had marched in. "Getting cooler," Buckjack said. "They'll be busy far into the night between us and the Fays." Centaurs, like horses, only slept 2 or 3 hours a night, and Fays were nocturnal more often than not. "Let's have a look," and he led the way across the road to the docks. There, looming and swelling like an iceberg or a grounded cumulus cloud, lay the white bulk of the GNNV Bethos. The Grand Norman naval vessel was a mix of new, old, and mythic, a schooner of old-style lines made of modern materials, spiced with alchemy, and fitted with modern instruments, nursed by gremlins. It was bound for places even more exotic than itself. Behind it, the Aegean Sea lay quiet at present, but rising above the horizon was the edge storm, boiling with clouds and tossing off chunks of rainbow, and beyond the edge storm lay the frayed boundary of Brickell's little continuum, fluttering in hyperspace. Mostly. Here and there were passages to other such continua, or back to Earth. The Bethos would seek out those passages, hoping they were still there and still led where they had. Once in that next worldlet, Buckjack and Carlin would disembark along with their classmates. So would other dedicated cavalrymen and folk of the standard cavalry, in which men and horses were separate beings, the infantry and majory. They would explore and survey the lands of the Hathor passages, while the crew of the Bethos mapped the waters. If all went well, the Bethos would end up back here at this dock in Cote Deese, and Grand Normandy would have another increment of knowledge. The dedicated cavalry class of 17, including Carlin and Buckjack, would march back through the land passage to their base in Upham, Berkshire, trainees no more, fully qualified for the next round of exploration. That was the plan, anyway. Buckjack and Carlin wandered along the dock, craning their necks to view the tops of masts, catching glimpses through hatches and portholes, staying out of the way of busy men, women, less identifiable fey things, and a few senior centaurs. They would be swept up into this activity soon, but their time was not yet. They reached the prow. The gilded figurehead was a bearded centaur with a telescope raised to his eye, his rear body becoming a fishtail that twined up and around the bowsprit. "A mer-centaur," Carlin observed, "double dippin' on the transformations." "Ichthyocentaur," Buckjack supplied. "There were two, Bethos and Aphros, sons of Poseidon." And the GNNV Aphros was twin vessel to the Bethos. The Grand Norman Navy was small, and these were the only two ships specially fitted to transport centaurs. "Fletcher!" Carlin exclaimed, pointing at the figurehead's face. "That's Fletcher!" Captain Fletcher was their instructor and commanding officer. Buckjack stared doubtfully at the gilded profile, then shook his head. "Nah, that's just a generic guy. Why would it be Fletcher?" "Hey, trained about a third of the guys in Dedicated. Elaine trained another third, and the last third are from way back when." "Information courtesy of Charlie Horse?" "Of course." Carlin, dispenser of nicknames, had seriously considered redubbing Charles Charlie Horse Darnley as Answer Man or Numbers Guy. "You think there were such things?" Carlin asked, still gazing at the figurehead. Buckjack shrugged. "Can't say no. Look at us. A shapeshifter like a puka or a Headley cow could do it, I suppose. But as a true shape?" Another shrug. Carlin had shifted his gaze down to the water. He made a megaphone of his hands and shouted, "Hey!" Buckjack looked down and saw a merman in the act of surfacing. It looked like he had been working on the hull a bit below the waterline. Buckjack could just discern the oval outline of an instrument port or some such. "Hey!" Carlin shouted again to the mer-tech. His half-smile had become a full grin, and he pointed to the figurehead. "What do you think of our recruiting poster? Take an arrow and give the cavalry a seahorse." The merman waved his hand dismissively, but grinned back and called, "Our ship, our poster. Chew the weed and give us a seahorse." Then he dove, but not deeply. A floating tool bag on a tether followed him around to the other side of the ship. Fletcher looked back at the figurehead. "Do you think you can stack transformations that way?" Buckjack shrugged again. "Never heard that it's been tried." He eyed the figure and grimaced. What a useless form. What good are horse legs in the sea or a fishtail on land? If anyone ever wore that shape, I hope it was a shifter doing it for fun or for show. What a thing to inflict on anyone. He was a little surprised to see a spark kindle in Carlin's eyes. "Good point. Yeah, let's say that's an old god in fancy dress. They did that kind of thing. Still say they used Fletcher for the model." Having had their look at the Bethos, they crossed the road and began strolling past the stores. "About the same as back home," Carlin said, "only more cramped." Upham, the town that hosted the cavalry base, allowed extra space for larger customers. "Ah, this one's different. Different stuff." It was a Chandler, a hardware store full of boating and shipping gear. Carlin removed his fine hat and ducked through the door. Buckjack stood preoccupied for a moment, looking up and down the road, then followed. Floorboards clumped and creaked under their hooves. It was a big place with a high ceiling, but very full, and they had just made it fuller. Engines, pumps, motors, pipes, small buoys occupied racks and stacks, along with cans and tubs and drums and everyday tools. No other customers at the moment. They edged their way through. "This is what agility class was for," Buckjack muttered. I forgot how much of this stuff was, textile, fabric, and rope," Carlin said, gazing about. Folded sails and nets, spooled cabling and fishing line, hats and heavy weather gear took at least as much space as the machinery. "You forgot?" echoed Buckjack. Carlin rarely alluded to his past. You worked on ships? Nah, but I was always down at the London docks and on and off ships. Stuff like this always piled around, getting used, getting sold. He trailed off. Buckjack had lived flank to flank with Carlin for most of a year, but still felt he had most of his work ahead of him getting to know this classmate. Seeing the water kind of made me homesick for Stirk, he ventured, like a fisherman casting out a line. Carlin had been staring at nothing and everything. Like this, he suddenly went on, now brisk, but more and bigger and dirtier. I like a clean shop. So said the rangy, middle-aged woman standing behind the counter at the far wall. Buckjack, who had put his hat back on after he entered, tipped it to her and smiled. She probably did not notice. Carlin had had his hat in his hand. He now flipped it, caught it, clapped it to his head, and then tipped it to her, while upping the wattage on his smile. Très propre, he agreed. Cavalryman Julian Carlin, madam, and this is my friend Buckjack, John Weldon. She smiled back, polite but not impressed. Do you sail on the Bethos? Yes, madame. Trainees from Upham? Yes again, madame. She nodded. You sound like it. Her own Chenelaise was tilted toward French, as theirs toward English. Are you looking for anything? Buckjack tried another hat tip and smile. Just looking around, madame, he said diffidently. We got settled in at the caravansary, so I asked our captain if we could poke about. He said, very well, there's nothing to do for a bit. You're explorers, go explore. We'll try not... Are those fish and flies, madame? Carlin broke in, pointing to a little display at the end of the counter. Oui, you fish? No. But he moved over to the display anyway and began poking around. The lady looked to Buckjack for explanation, but he knew nothing and just shrugged. He paced over to the counter himself. Madame, do you know Harry Morley? She looked up at the looming young man-horse and considered. I do not think so, unless he is married to Matilda Morley. That's him, the merman. They come from my hometown. I heard they moved to Brickell. She comes in occasionally. I do not recall if I have seen him. Most people would recall seeing a merman, but not a resident of Côte d'Is. They were too common here. Carlin now came to them with a couple of boxes of fishing flies, each holding 3 brilliant bits of stabby allure. If you're not going fishing, what are they for? Buckjack asked. Decoration, Carlin replied. Buckjack rolled his eyes as one who should have guessed. You're going to put them in your hat? Not this hat, he answered, but my duty hat could use some spicing up. So could yours. Here. He tossed one box at Buckjack. Thanks, he supposed. You think they'll make us look more nautical? He watched the proprietress suppress a smile as she took the payment. I think they'll make us look sharper. Wear them to good fortune, mes garçons, she told them, smiling openly now. Maybe some fish will land on your heads. They laughed, thanked her, wheeled, and made their way out. Outside, Carlin twitched the hat off Buckjack's head and started inserting flies in the band. So who's this merman you were asking about? Harry Morley. He got changed just a few years ago. Got changed? Did he dive or was he pushed? Pushed. He was a longshoreman in Stirk, juggling goods across the Sundering. He watched Carlin insert a bristly orange-gold fly in his hat band. He hadn't asked for it and wasn't sure he wanted it. But it showed a generous, if managing, side to Carlin, and maybe that should be encouraged. A few years ago, he went on, he and 2 mates were sent on a delivery to a boat that wasn't there, got grabbed, had merweeds stuffed in their mouths, then shoved in the water. Hey presto, mermen. And then something or some seeming chased them way out to sea. Harry made it back home a year later. His mates got lost in a storm and haven't been seen since. In went the next fly, sparkly silver with crimson flaps. It looked nothing like a small prey animal to Buckjack. He wondered how it looked to a fish. Would merfolk know? Carlin took his time placing it. They tried hard to find out who and why. I think the constable grilled everyone on the street, and maybe there were even detectives sent in from Majory, but no luck. Best guess is either the guys had some dangerous information without knowing it, and the criminals didn't even want their ghosts available for questioning, or it was some kind of sacrifice. You okay? Carlin had jabbed in the third fly, an iridescent blue disc with a sharp grunt. Stick yourself? Fine, Carlin growled. I can think of one more motive. Bullying. The pure pleasure of messing someone's life just to prove you have the power. Buckjack studied Carlin's face. The usual half-smile was gone, and his classmate was staring into some fire only he could see. Maybe, he said cautiously, but merweed is expensive. A lot of trouble to go to only to mess someone around for fun. I mean, you could mess them around just as much for free with a jackknife, just no cool special effects. Maybe they have specialized tastes, Carlin spat in an undertone. Of course, he added, still hissing, if you use a magic arrow, the crown pays for it. His gaze returned from the internal furnace, and he met Buckjack. So, you're looking for him here? Buckjack stowed speculations away for later consideration and nodded. They moved to Brickell a year or so after he got back, because of the other merfolk here. But I don't know exactly where. Somewhere in Côte d'Is, it seems. Who are you looking for? Asked a new voice. They turned and saw the speaker was a young boy. They stared. The boy was a colt. Their classmate Danny Bryce had been transformed at 16. That was as young as the cavalry took them, and it had been more than 3 generations since Grand Normandy had encountered any other centaurs. But this boy could be no more than 10 or a small 11. He stood bare in the summer evening, cinnamon skin, black hair, brown eyes. His equine body was white with black stockings and tail, as leggy as a colt simple of only a few months. Who are you looking for? He asked again. He grinned proudly. I bet I can help. I know everyone in town. Buckjack nodded, but then cocked his head and asked, Are you Giacomo? Joachim, the colt boy corrected them. He broadened his grin, taking his fame as his due. Buckjack fished up a smile of his own. Pleased to meet you, Joachim. I'm Buckjack, and this is Style. He turned to Carlin. Style, this guy's our senior. He's been up on hooves 6 or 7 years. Carlin still stared, but the half-smile began creeping back. That's right, said Joachim. They did it when I was little to cure me. Who is it you're looking for? He asked again. Harold Morley. Harry. The merman from England? Sure, I'll show you his berth. Joachim turned in an easy, tight pivot that Buckjack found he still envied, though he thought he could do that well after a year of agility classes, and led them back down the road and across to the docks. So what about this kid? Carlin asked in a low tone as they followed. He's like Horsepower? Their classmate Horsepower had transformed to cure himself of cystic fibrosis. Usually, transformation did not overwrite such diseases, but sometimes a blessing cropped up in the mere magic. Yeah, it was a big news story for one day about 7 years ago, Buckjack answered, also low. I forget what he had, hemophilia maybe. He was dying fast, but the scryers said transformation would fix it in his case. His parents begged the crown to let him become a centaur. They agreed right away. I remember the news clip. The king and queen attended while Elaine shot him. Joachim's mother had collapsed into the king's arms. The queen had hugged his weeping father. And in the foreground, the new boy colt had risen, stumbling and smiling. Had his parents' tears been from relief? Buckjack's mother had wept from some mix of sorrow and horror. And then I guess they moved to Brickell, Buckjack concluded. It made sense. Here, off the home zone, they need not cope with the sundering and a transformed child, and Brickell was one of the biggest off-zone holdings. The choice of transformation made sense too. The crown did not control the changes into merfolk, and after would be the barrier of the sea itself, unless the whole family changed. A little boy could not be turned into a satyr, something or else be praised. If he were changed into a fae, he would be lost in another way. And he knows everyone in town, Carlin reflected. I guess he's kind of a town mascot for now. For now? Hey, Joachim, Carlin called. What do you want to be when you grow up? I'm joining the cavalry, he answered promptly. Look how chevelin I am already. And he paused to rear a little, displaying his back as he looked over his shoulder. A stripe of hair, no wider than a heavy eyebrow, ran down his spine. Buckjack had already noticed it. Something a little more robust ran down his own back. Such things appeared to be a random variation in the spell. You figure you'll get horsier as you grow up? He asked. Sure, I'm practicing wiggling my ears. He dropped back on all fours and took on a stuffed expression. Looking carefully, the two stallions could see his ears wiggle a millimeter or so. Cool, Carlin admired. Joachim went from stuffed back to smiling and resumed leading them. Well, I guess that's all sorted, Carlin said, going back to the low tone. Hope he doesn't decide he wants to be a jet pilot next week. On the other hand, Buckjack murmured back, if he decides to be a math professor, he'll just need an extra large office. Could he get horsier as he grows? Buckjack shrugged. He knew of no precedents. Pursuing a previous line of thought, Buckjack remarked, he seems quite happy about his situation, like horsepower. Carlin grunted and nodded. Beats being dead. Then, in a merely apparent change of subject, Buckjack remarked, you looked furious when I told you about Harry. My horse is getting to me. More fodder for speculation. A few months in, their class had developed the private slang of referring to one's equine side as my horse. Fletcher had overheard them and had given them a polite but firm lecture on why they should not speak that way. Their new equine nature was not something separate. In mind and heart, as well as body, they were now both horses and men, both at once. And if that was a tricky proposition, on the other hand, they could now draw on both species' strengths. But to think of their equine aspect as something apart from themselves was an opening for regarding it as something they might fear, or could reject, or not be responsible for. Afterward, Charlie Horse told them that Fletcher had been sparing their anxieties, which Charlie Horse himself apparently did not choose to do. He had researched the psychological effects of transformation thoroughly before signing up. No one was surprised. They knew Charlie Horse by now. Failure to embrace one's inner horse could result in problems like body dysphoria, depersonalization, and alien limb syndrome. It's even worse than usual if it applies to the bulk of your body. He then had to explain what those were. His classmates were suitably aghast. Fletcher did not flat out forbid them to use my horse because he knew the order to be unenforceable, and Carlin occasionally used it out of Fletcher's hearing to express impatience with the new side of his life. Buckjack ran through the inferences. Fellow feeling is at least as human as it is equine, he pointed out mildly, meaning you don't have to blame your sympathy for Harry on your horse. Carlin shook his head, though Buckjack wasn't sure what he meant by it. Big old herd animal, that's me now. Now? Well, if transforming had made Carlin more compassionate, maybe that was a good thing, even if it annoyed him. It had made Charlie Horse bolder, horsepower calmer, brought Paul Fells out of a deep depression. It had let Danny feel all grown up, and it had put Buckjack's broken heart behind him. But had Carlin been aiming to develop his compassion and become a big old herd animal? It didn't seem likely. Why had Carlin enlisted? All he ever said on the matter was, it looked like fun. It is a sad story, Buckjack admitted. Sad? It's a bad story, an evil story. No argument. Well, we'll find out more about Harry's story and what Carlin thinks of it next time.